So, are we online now, Kuntam? Okay. Good evening, everybody in the clubhouse, and also people who are viewing this event online on Facebook. I'm Gwen Robinson, the past president of the Foreign Correspondent Club and editor-at-large of the Nikkei Asian Review. We're here tonight, as you know, to discuss Myanmar's looming, well, Myanmar and Thailand's looming refugee crisis. This is, by the way, just one in a new series that we've launched about programs focused on Myanmar. We're hoping to bring you at least one every couple of weeks. Actually, in the next week, we have a second Myanmar event in a week on the 27th about whether there is an ASEAN solution to Myanmar's crisis. And I think that's got a few big question marks after it, particularly after the news that the Thai Prime Minister is not likely to go to ASEAN for the crisis meeting on the 24th about Myanmar. And also this week on the 22nd, that's Thursday, we're bringing you a very interesting program on the return of the red shirts, also with a question mark, about Thai politics and indications that the red shirt movement is regrouping and bouncing back in a different form from last time. And a reminder that the Myanmar event on the 27th is an online-only event. The one on Thursday will be, again, like tonight, in the club and on Facebook live streamed. We are observing some very strict social distancing. Therefore, tonight, as you might know, is strictly limited to 40 people. We will continue those restrictions until we hear otherwise. So, returning right now to our program for the night, and just a very quick introduction to our excellent panel, two of who are there on the screen online, joining us from other locations outside. So first on my right on the physical panel is Sally Thompson, Executive Director of the Border Consortium, a loose coalition of NGOs who work along the Thai-Myanmar border. Next to her and closest to me is Panu Wongchaum, Reuters Senior Correspondent and FCCT President, who has recently spent quite a few days going up and down along the border and brings some first-hand insights on the ground with what he saw and heard there. On the screen, on the far left, we have, sorry about this, I can't see the Moon Nae Lee. Moon Nae Lee, sorry, on the right.
On the far right.
Yeah, on the right, closest to me, Moon Nae Lee with her hand up is the Secretary of the Kachin Women's Association of Thailand, which has been extremely active and informative with a lot of updates about what is going on, not just inside Kachin but other areas as well. And on her right, which is my far left, is Waku Shi, Standing Committee member of Karen Women's Organisation and a director of the Karen Peace Support Network. Again, incredibly brave and informative group that has been really keeping up with what the situation is on the ground. So we thought we'd kick off tonight with Sally Thompson as an overview to bring some perspective of what is actually happening, the situation on the Thai-Myanmar border. And I've asked her just to give a very, very quick bit of background on the situation as it was on the Thai border and as it is now. So, Sally, over to you.
Okay, thank you very much, Gwen, and thank you to the FCCT for organising this timely panel. As Gwen said, I'm going to start off with a bit of a situation overview, and I really want to just start pre the February 1st coup and just say a little about Thailand, as it has been a refugee receiving country for decades. And over the last 35 years, Thailand has played host to over 250,000 refugees from Myanmar. many of whom subsequently have left for resettlement to third countries. Others have left to find work in the migrant communities in Thailand, and more recently, refugees have been preparing to return to Myanmar. And around 22,000 people have returned to Myanmar informally without assistance since the bilateral ceasefires and the transition to civilian rule under the NLD. And another 1,000 people have gone back with assistance through the bilateral formal voluntary return process. So today, however, there are still over 80,000 refugees in 9 camps along the border. The majority are from southeastern Myanmar, states of Kaya, Kachin, Mon, and also Tanindari region. And some of the reasons why there is reluctance to return as yet are really the same factors that underpin the looming humanitarian crisis referred to in the title of this panel. It is around security and livelihoods. And one of the first questions refugees ask you when you talk about return is, well, who can guarantee my security? Who will hold the army to account? And for many, they have seen the Tatmadaw repeatedly commit violations and atrocities in their villages with impunity. They've witnessed the 4 cuts policy over decades in ethnic areas. They've given shelter to democracy activists after the slaughter in 1988. They've seen monks brutalized in the so-called Saffron Revolution of 2006, the genocide and mass exodus of Rohingya in 2017, the ongoing conflicts in Kachin, Northern Shan and Karen states. And all this has happened under the same army. And it is the same army that today is brutalizing its own people again. And people are saying no more. They are angry, they want change, and it will all likely come at a terrible cost of lives. The COVID pandemic has compounded the isolation of life in the camps, which have largely been closed for the last year, with very limited access in and out of the camps. This has negatively impacted food security, increased aid dependency, and with border closures, the return of refugees to Myanmar has ground to a halt. To date, there have only been 2 reported cases linked to the camps of COVID-19, which were identified through screening, swiftly transferred to the local Thai hospital where they recovered, and cooperation with provincial health authorities has been good, and now we wait for the vaccination rollout to further protect the communities in the border areas. But the story in Myanmar is quite different. The military's seizure of power has escalated the risk of COVID-19 transmission into a potential regional security threat in 2021. The testing regime, rollout of vaccinations, and the public health system have become dysfunctional as health professionals have been at the forefront of the civil disobedience movement. And the learnt culture of social distancing has been replaced by mass protests. And since the coup in February, the civil disobedience movement has turned into a nationwide movement and been met, as we've seen, with disproportionate and escalating violence by the military. And this has resulted in movement into the ethnic areas by people fleeing political persecution, and one also has to assume that these people are potential carriers of COVID into other areas throughout the country. And once again, the Karen, Karenni, Mon and Shan ethnic groups are providing a buffer zone between Thailand and Myanmar for these people fleeing political persecution. The Thai authorities here are leading the contingency planning for an influx at both local and national levels. Holding areas near potential crossing points have been identified along the border with Myanmar, and the NGOs, UNHCR, IOM, have been invited by some local authorities to assess what needs to be put in place in these areas. Generally, what we're seeing is existing facilities have been identified, like schools, temples, border police training centres, agricultural warehouses, but some are just plainly open spaces, fields in remote areas. And nothing has yet been established or has been operationalized. They've been identified, but that's as far as it goes. And in the meantime, what have we seen? Ongoing militarization in contravention of the ceasefire agreement has already displaced thousands of people in northern Karen state, and subsequently, at the end of March, airstrikes by the Tatmadaw on civilian targets caused over 4,000 people to flee across the Salween into Thailand, into remote forest areas. And if this was a blueprint for the influx, it raises concerns as to what lies ahead. Because within a day of these people arriving in Thailand, the Thai military had ordered them back to Myanmar without allowing any access for humanitarian assistance. But the people haven't returned to their villages. They continue to hide out in the forests and along the riverbanks. And they're adding to the swelling numbers of IDPs in need of essential assistance in Myanmar. We've seen many local Thai communities have responded with donations and in-kind assistance, but in the immediate days following the pushback across the border, assistance and access to these communities was denied. But we have to say we look to the past, we look at history, and we can only hope that history repeats and local arrangements allow the delivery of assistance across national borders, that it will prevail to mitigate against a potential emergency on both sides of the border. So the Thai approach to an influx essentially appears to be one of detain people at the border by the Thai military, hold them for a short time, send them back to Myanmar as soon as possible. Well, this may have worked in recent years where conflicts in border areas tended to be local skirmishes that were resolved quickly. But now we're looking at something entirely different. We're looking at a country hurtling towards collapse. However, if the Thai authorities determine that people cannot return, then they'll be screened for COVID, transferred to the holding areas where they'll receive humanitarian assistance, and depending on the scale of the influx, the international community may be asked to assist. However, one thing is clear, the existing caseload in the refugee camps will be kept separate from this new potential influx along the border. So currently, the land border with Thailand is closed, and there are no formal procedures for displaced people to cross the border. Refugee status determination hasn't been operationalized since 2005. The government is currently developing a national screening mechanism for people seeking asylum, but this is still not complete. So what we have today is around 7,000 IDPs in border areas along the Salween River, opposite Mae Hong Son province, and somewhere over 1,000 in hiding in forest areas in Thailand. There are at least 20,000 internally displaced in northern Karen state, in addition to several thousand who fear political persecution in urban areas and have fled to the border areas. Increased military and police checkpoints are restricting access to these ethnic areas. The economy in Myanmar is collapsing. Salaries are no longer being paid. People's livelihoods are disappearing as they are in hiding for their own safety. The country is heading for a humanitarian crisis, with internal displacement increasing daily, and this could rapidly become a regional refugee crisis as people cross the border in search of protection and humanitarian assistance. So what do we want? It is essential that people are allowed to cross borders without fear of detention, to ensure access to humanitarian assistance and protection until it is safe for people to return, but also to enable assistance to reach those who remain internally displaced in Myanmar. So I'm going to stop there for now, and I will move on so my colleagues can certainly describe what's actually happening in some of the ethnic areas in Myanmar and the response.
Thanks so much, Sally. That was really an excellent rundown and gave us also a bit of an overall picture. So there's plenty to come back to there. And I just want to say on that point, we will be taking questions. You're welcome if you're watching on Facebook. Please ask questions on Facebook. My colleague here, Phil Robertson, will be monitoring those and relaying those to me. And you will have a chance here in the clubhouse to ask questions from the floor. By the way, though, due to some very strict guidelines about closing at 9 p.m. on the dot, we will be trying to keep everything tight and need to move questions through very quickly, as well as the discussion. So just a reminder, we really need to be out of here or closed down by 9. Anyway.
We just stopped selling food at 9.
Oh, sorry, we stopped selling food at 9.
Close at 10.
Oh, the club has to close at 10. Okay. So, okay. We do have some time, but anyway, just a reminder that we'll try to keep it tight. So I think we'll turn next to Refugee of the Karen Peace Support Network. Refugee, over to you. A quick rundown on how you see the situation both in the area you're dealing with and along the border.
Yes, thank you. Thanks to FCCT for organizing this and inviting us to be part of speakers. And before I start, I would like to mention that just a few months before the military coup, over 5,000 Karen civilians have been displaced, and also are urgent need of humanitarian assistance because of the ongoing offensive, as well as mortar shelling around the villages and in the farming area by the Burma army. That was before the before the military coup. So after the military coup, we have seen that many people that participated in the anti-coup demonstrations and joined the CDM movement in the city and the towns have been killed, arbitrarily arrested, inhumanly tortured, brutally murdered. And according to the AAPP, there are over 3,000 that over 700 people have been killed. More than 3,000 people have been detained. Currently, those who fled to the ethnic areas, who make their way to the ethnic areas, I mean to different ethnic areas, especially in the current areas, we received about 3,000 people that fled from the city who are participating in the civil disobedience movement. And they are now in the current area in 7 districts. So when they first arrived, because we are not prepared and we are not ready to receive a lot of people, so there's no facility taking place. And when they first arrived, there are a lot of challenges in terms of building, food, and the water supplies. And also it's really very difficult for those who are hosting these people. And we started to connect with the international and also try to raise some funding to respond to this emergency need of those who arrived in our areas. And on 27 March, the regime also launched airstrike. As some of you know, that in current state that killed about 10 people and also wounded more than 8 people. And currently displaced within the Brigade 7 and Brigade 3, it displaced about 40 people. So 2,000 people who have made their way to the border and crossed to Thailand were pushed back by the Thai army. And also those who from the IDP camp, Ituta, IDP camp, also about 2,000 people. So in total at that time, it was about 4,000 people that fled to Thai side and were pushed back by the Thai army. It has been very difficult for those who are elderly and the sick people, the children, pregnant women, the weather is really hot. So when they were pushed back, going back and forth, many times, and they also, especially for the elderly, they have to be carried, and you have to go, on the bank of the river, and then come back and forth, running around, and it's really tired, exhausted, and the weather is really hot, and it's really difficult for them. And later they have decided to come back and hide in the current state around where the IDP camps are. Currently in Thailand, Thai-Burma border, we have about 8,000 people. And the Thai authority also has opened up from the beginning aid and humanitarian aid to the IDP, those who fled to the Thai side. The aid were blocked by the Thai army, but now due to the negotiations, and they have opened up a bit for some boats and trucks to deliver food to those who are in urgent need. But just yesterday or the day before, the Burma army camp has opened fire to the boats that transport food to the IDP camps. So now, like, those who are using the boats have to be suspended. And finally, I would like to, recommend that my recommendation to you all is to publicly reject the military coup and call the military to stop offensive throughout the country, pull back troops, and immediately release all political prisoners, and suspend all for the international, to call on international to suspend all political and financial support to the military regime and impose immediate sanctions on the military-owned and controlled company, including imposing arms embargoes. And another recommendation is for the international to provide humanitarian aid cross-border to the displaced community in Eastern Burma, and also to resume adequate level humanitarian aid to the refugee in the camps along the Thai-Burma border. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Wakushi. Just adding very quickly, the Karen areas were at the front line initially of Tatmadaw attacks, and we read a lot about the targeting of areas and the bombings of villages. There's a lot of confusion, I think, about where that's going. Do you get are they continuing to target the same areas or have extended attacks to other areas? Is the flow of refugees coming from different areas in recent times? What's the military situation in there?
Actually, after March 27, after the first airstrikes, the fighter jets also come every day and monitor the area, fly around over the villages. So that's where the villagers are have to live in the constant fear. But it's not only in Brigade, the offensive or shelling is not only in Brigade 5 in Mudra district, but as well as in Brigade 5, Brigade 3, and there were clashes in Brigade 6 and Brigade 4. So right. It's everywhere. Right.
So you're saying it's expanding.
It's expanding, yes.
Yeah. Okay, thank you very much. We'll come back to that. So I think over to Moon Nae Lee, Secretary of the Kachin Women's Association of Thailand. Similarly, let's hear your view and an update from your area. Over to you.
Thank you so much.
Oh, can you speak up a little bit, Moon Nae Lee?
Hello?
Yeah, but speak a little bit louder. Thanks.
Oh, yes. Hello. Thank you so much for giving a chance to share about the current situation and how brutally happened in Kachin area, and about how the IDP and the humanitarian needed and the crisis. So I would like to clarify my position. I'm former General Secretary, and currently I'm a spokesperson and also take responsible as an advocacy officer especially for international advocacy. So our Kachin areas geographically located between the big country, India and China. So for Kachin people when this kind of the fighting or the crisis happening. So all of this, the community, especially the conflict affected people, are really difficulty situation. They cannot go to the China side or India side. So that's why there is a big challenges for the Kachin people. And everybody already know about the, February 1st, the military coup happened in Burma. So then there is over more than 300 township the uprising and demonstration happening. So however, before there is only we see that the conflict between the red and green, like NLD and the military. So finally, all of the civilians, including the ethnic people, are the same goal to against the military dictatorship. So that's why there is this time is really important for unity and to build what we want federal democracy in our country. That is for the genuine peace in Burma. So the current but the military coup, that's a lot of human rights violation happening. There is more than 700 people already killed by the military, and also the thousands of people are already detained. And they also, destroy and broken and rob civilians' property. So based on this situation, on 2nd of April, as my organization released one of the update situation report. Based on this, our report, in town, the military and police had been using live ammunition against the protester. So a lot of human rights violation happening. So the civilians are in very dangerous situation and not safety at daytime or nighttime, because they are also in daytime when the civilians is not come out to the street, but they are just coming and broken their gate and door, and they took arrest the people. So that's why currently that is very dangerous for the the dangerous situation for the civilians. So in rural area, during escalated conflict with the KIA and Burma Army, so the Burma Army is mortar shelling to the villages because they are just intentionally targeted to the civilians. So so a lot of people, including the women and children, are dying for this mortar shelling. And also they also using the jet fighter for dropping the bombing in the area. They are, they are just bombing, not targeted to the KIO post. They are just also targeted to the civilians area. So that's why a lot of people are scary and fleeing to the very safety places. And why the coup has happened in entire country into insecurity and complicated situation, the escalation of conflict in northern Burma will have especially consequences. So our community remain ravaged by the Burma armies, that renewal of war against the KIA since 2011. That is a long time, nearly 10 years already. So so that's why there is a lot of IDP are, now is also increasing the IDP number. So the situation is really worsens, and also the existing humanitarian crisis is also a big problem and challenges for the IDP. So however, the community are trying to, solve this, the IDP humanitarian aid. So continue the fighting and in our area, not only in northern Burma, but also in other Karen and also in Shan State also happening seriously, because the military are sending more troops into the ethnic area to control all of the things and also to destroy and like using for doing the ethnic cleansing in that area. So that's why the IDP number is also increasing every day. And so here I also want to mention that the PERS NCA and peace process is also just for show to international community. So because of the conflict, the Burma army already committed war crimes and crimes against humanity, including the sexual violence. That sexual violence is they're using as a weapon of war. A lot of the cases happen in the Kachin area in the past. So the current situation now, there is ongoing the fighting, and also the Burma army ongoing committed the war crimes by shelling, the mortar shelling, and also using the jet fighter for dropping the bomb into that Kachin areas. So and also most of the because of this why this increasing the IDP number, most of the IDP are they are scary and also worry for their security. So that's why they have to flee to the safety place. Some are hiding in the jungle, and some are fleeing to the church compound or church with the church community. Even though there's some area there is not fighting, but the Burma army is also targeted and attacked to the civilians. So that's why they have to flee. They have become IDP. So more than thousands IDP numbers increasing in current offensive until now. So I also want to share about the humanitarian and aid situation. The current situation, the IDP are very difficult situation in the IDP camp because COVID-19 is also, a big problem, a big challenges, and also at the same time the military coup is happening. So the other hand, continue fighting is happening in the area. So war crimes and all of this human rights violation is happening. So that's why for the IDP is really difficult, to survive themselves. Even though this situation, some NGO have the IDP support fund, but they could not be supported in current situation because they cannot withdraw the money from the bank. And even though they can using like a mobile banking or online shopping or something like that, but the military already cutting the internet, and so they have no internet access. So that's why they cannot solve the problem for give support to the IDP, even though they have some money. So that's why now the IDP they need the basic needs like food, shelter for the IDP, including a new IDP, because for the old IDP they are just built like a temporary shelter. So now already nearly 10 years. So that's why all of their shelter are already not very good and already destroyed by the wind or something, for the natural disaster. So that's why they also need to build the new shelter. And also because of this long years of the situation at the IDP are staying in the IDP camp, there is already increasing the new family. So that's why they also need this kind of the shelter for new family members. So for the health situations, there is also a big challenges for the IDP because now the IDP camp is very crowded, and also their shelter and the camp is also very small. So that's why for the COVID-19 or other the medical like health problems happen very easy to happen in the IDP camps. Since 2019, the NGO already stopped for supporting for some of the medicine and also give support for some equipment to the IDP camp. So that's why they have not much supporting for the IDP, especially for the health. So they also need to rebuild the shelter for volunteer of the health worker and also nurses, because they are already long time they are solving this problem. So that's why all of the things are already ruined and broken right. In that area. At the same time, for the education situation, they also need to build the new school, especially for the middle school, because there is a lot of children are newborn or they are already grew up, so they have not enough school. So that's why they also need to build a new school, and also they still need the teaching materials. And we also need to support for the volunteer teacher, because most of the volunteer teacher are just have some very small stipend. So that's why they also need some kind of the support to the volunteer teacher. Now the rainy season will coming, so for the children, they also need some kind of the raincoat or some the thing the children need it now. Right. So the military dictatorship is also a big things for the people from Burma. So that's why we also need to solve the root cause of the conflict. So that is, everybody know that the Panglong Agreement is very important to fulfill this agreement. So we also have some concern and recommendation. Current military coup will have the deepest impact on those who are already marginalized due to the decades of civil wars and ongoing human rights violations that committed by the Burma army. So the humanitarian aid must be closely monitored to ensure that it is benefit the conflict-affected ethnic community, and it is not to the military regime. So we also want to call some recommendation. We strongly urge concerned international pressure on the military coup leader to immediately end violence against the civilians across Burma, release all political prisoners, and withdraw troops from the ethnic conflict areas. And also, we also want to call to the UN Security Council to impose a global embargo on Burma and to refer the situation in Burma to the International Criminal Court. And also, we call all foreign governments to announce that the coup regime is illegitimate and to impose sanctions on any businesses giving revenue to the regime. Right. And another is we also want to call foreign donors to ensure that their aid is not legitimizing or subsidizing the regime in any way, and to direct humanitarian aid through cross-border channel. So it is very, very important for the people who are really affected by the conflict and also this violence. Finally, we call all Burma's neighboring countries, including China and Thailand, to provide safe refuge to those fleeing conflict and persecution, and allow them access to humanitarian aid. Thank you. So much.
Thank you very much, Moon Nay Lee, for that update. Before we move to Panu, I'd just like very quickly maybe to ask both of you, Wakushi and Moon Nay Lee, it's very, very difficult now, almost impossible for NGOs, particularly international as well as local inside Myanmar, to support things like IDP camps. So you said that it's extremely limited, the support. I think there's only 2 international organisations that are actually permitted to move around with any degree of autonomy. That's WFP and ICRC. But what's the situation with these ID camps you're talking about? You mentioned very little support. Is there any support, international or local, from outside, or are the local people supporting it themselves? Maybe start with you, Wakushi.
I think the two organizations that you mentioned, I don't think that they have been to the conflict-affected area, or especially, in the current or like other ethnic states.
Could you speak up a little bit?
Can you hear
Thanks.
me now? Yeah, the two organizations you mentioned.
Yeah.
I don't think they have been to the conflict-affected areas, apart from some of the town and cities. But of course, ethnic states, but maybe in the city or in the towns. I'm not sure if we have seen them in the conflict areas.
Right.
And apart from that, the local NGOs and some international NGOs that also provide their support through the community-based organizations like TBC and the other, who are also working closely with the community-based organization and provide support through the community existing structure.
Right, thank you. And Muneli,
Yes, in Kachin area, that some of the international NGO organization are some kind of give support to the IDP, but not they cannot access to a big support to, especially in the remote area, in the KL control area. So most of the IDP are staying in the China control China border area. Right. So that's why I already mentioned that some NGO have money to support to the IDP or humanitarian is supporting, but the situation is they cannot withdraw money from bank, or also because of the cutting all of the internet, so they cannot also using mobile banking or some kind of the solve this kind of the problem.
right. So you're saying local people are trying to support the IDPs?
Yes.
I see, thanks. So turning to Panu Wongchom, you spent 10 days up and around the border area. I think one of the key things sitting in Bangkok, that as we're at the Foreign Correspondents Club, so all our colleagues have had similar experience of a big disconnect in what the truth is. We've been told sometimes by the Thai government that there's a humanitarian policy being observed, and then refugees are not being pushed back, and we've had extremely concrete evidence that they have been. So it's very difficult now to assess the situation, but perhaps you could talk about what you saw and what you reported. Over to you, Panu.
Sure, Gwen. I'll try to keep it as concise and brief. I was there around the border for about 15 days, but I would just divide it into the three phrases. The first being, before, when I was there first, when the conflict was brewing inside Myanmar, and then the 27th, the Armed Forces Day, when there was airstrikes and the mass influx, and then sort of a look back, a reflection at the end. I'm not trying to repeat a lot of stuff that Sally had mentioned, the numbers and stuff. I mean, those things are very valuable, and thank you. But so I'm just trying to explain more of the experience I have from reporting and really trying to outline the thinking on this side of the border in Thailand about this mixed response that we are seeing. And what Gwen just said leading into my talk is that, we can categorize the Thai response in this past few weeks as not synchronized. There's a clear disconnect between Bangkok and the border. And there's multiple reasons for this. The first being this idea of the TBC, not your organization, but the Township Border Committee, which is a structured foreign relations between Thailand and neighboring countries at district level. So officials at the district level will have regular meetings with their counterpart on the other side of the border, whether it's Myanmar, Laos, Malaysia, wherever. But for the purpose of what we're seeing and the response that we saw with this pushback of refugees, one of the root causes is this relationship that is forged through the TBC. And the first experience, when I was up there covering the stories, if you recall before the mass influx of people, there was this case of mysterious 700 sacks of rice that the Thai military allegedly were delivering it to the Tatmadaw units on the other side of the Salaween River, across from Mae Hong Son. This unit has been surrounded by Karen KNU Brigade 5 troops for months, and they were basically hungry, and they basically asked the Thai to supply the rice. The Thais tried to do so, but there was so much backlash from the local community, from the KNU themselves, that the whole plan was changed and shifted at last minute. But what we saw there was essentially TBC at work, again, not your organization, is that the Thai commanders, the Thai military commanders at the border, as well as some of the sort of interior officials, do get requests, do get discussions with their counterpart on the other side of the border, and they will do things that not necessarily needed to be consulted by Bangkok, by policymakers in Bangkok. They will do things that they think is ad hoc enough, is small enough that they would just go ahead and do it. And when we have a situation in post-coup Myanmar like this, where the situation is deteriorating daily, and where there's a demand for a national response, what we found from reporting that 700 sacks of rice, that we get mixture of responses from people here in Bangkok, from the foreign ministry, from the Thai government spokesman, and also mixed responses from the military commander themselves, the one in Bangkok, the one in the 3rd Army responsible for the north, and so the one right at the border. They basically just not really being clear why these 700 rice sacks were trying to be delivered, appeared at this border town by the river, ready to be transported across for the Burmese military unit on the other side, amid protests, amid outcry from villagers on Thailand who fear that, this whole thing was unsafe for them, amid announcement by, the Karen Brigade 5 troops saying that, anyone who brings supply over to their enemy could create, could heighten the tension essentially and cause conflict. So you get a situation where you have local commanders, local officials do things with this TBC mechanism. And this is important because from time and time again, and I suspect going forward in the future, this TBC will come into more play. There may be times when the Burmese authority on the other side of various places of the Thai border asks the Thai authority to put blacklists or warrants or some other matters about legal issue that would block their opponents from fleeing into Thailand and such. These sort of things, there are signs of it already as happening, and it could happen more and more as we go along. So that's the TBC and the rice sack. We can see that disconnect really was not very comfortable for Bangkok to answer questions when the questions were raised, and eventually we saw them, the rice being removed by the Thais to kind of cover their tracks and not really fully, on one hand, Bangkok said they prefer the policy of non-interference. On the other hand, if you are supplying, one combatant side or food and you're kind of blocking supply to the other side, isn't that interference in itself? And this has raised a lot of questions to policymakers here in Bangkok from that episode. And then the next point I was going to make is about when the airstrikes happened on the 27th and what we saw, and I was up there in Mae Hong Son, it was an immediate block by the Thai military at the border of all these people who fled. I traveled to many spots and we couldn't even get near where the refugees were because the Thai military has totally taken control over the situation and blocked all the roads and routes. We have some local Karen contacts who helped us get through to some of these people. But even for local people, it was difficult for them to get through initially. And then Thai officials told me, point blank, that it is their policy when there is an influx of refugees coming to Thailand, their first reaction is the military is in charge. It's a national security issue. The military is in charge. Despite some of the humanitarian tradition that Sally mentioned, and it's true, the Thai's authority and people and public has this humanitarian tradition where they, for a long time, for decades, they have readily accepted people from Karen and elsewhere. They have readily supplied them with food and supplies. Even with all these traditions, we see a very tough response by the military. They block access, and at the earliest opportunity, they push them back. But after the story kind of broke, we saw a little bit more pressure coming over Bangkok. Then, a few days after this airstrike, we saw the Thais first accept 7 wounded people from Itutha, some Karen, ethnic Karen who were escaping from villages just north of Itutha camp, arriving across the river. Now the story in the headlines, and you probably, those of you who follow it will probably realize, oh yeah, the Thais accepted this 7 wounded. What happened though at the border was that these 7 wounded come on a small boat, and they were rejected first. The Thai military at this small town small village called Mae Sam Lap rejected them. The boat then went down the river for a while. Then through my Karen contact, I realized that the people in the boat made some calls to the Karen on the Thai side of the border, who made some call to the health officials, a town down the river. So the Thai health official who observed this humanitarian tradition brought in an ambulance to the port area of this small village. Then the boat returned to this port area, and in views of all these TV cameras, Thai and international reporters who were on there, the Thai military still will reject them the second time. They were doing this. The boat cannot come in. They were doing this. They were blocking it. The ambulance then drive right down to the port, pull out the stretcher, and said, we need to take the wounded. If the health official didn't do that, the military would still block the access to that boat. But what Bangkok got from that day was the headline that, yes, we are doing humanitarian assistance. They kicked out 2,000 people the day before, but they took in 7, right? So this is something that is quite alarming, and that was an experience of my reporting. And the third point and last point is that when I got back and reflect, I have covered the border issue for a decade. I've seen sort of short border conflicts leading to Karen people fleeing for a few days, for a few weeks, since 2010, even earlier. But what we saw this time around, and I've not only spent time covering the refugee, but we were talking to a lot of the ethnic armed leader, and we realized that the border is extra close this time. In the past, these ethnic arms groups, as well as NGOs, have had much more freedom operating on the Thai border and supplying for their brethren on the other side. And there was almost a tacit understanding between the authorities, between businesses, and between the local communities that this was the situation, this was the fluid border. Perhaps it's COVID, perhaps it's the fear of COVID that really has changed the mindset of the Thai government. But I sense there's something deeper. I think there's a larger shift of attitude that we see in this Thai government. You got to realize that covering the general election that lead to Prayut returning to power, one of the election pledges that Prime Minister Prayut had was that one of the success that he put in his election pledge was that Thailand was successfully pushing back the Rohingya refugees in 2015. So I think this is important going forward, because as situation in Myanmar deteriorate, and my friends here are telling you about all this stuff on the borderland, but also in Burma, heartland itself is deteriorating. You got to realize that that things here in Thailand has shifted too. Sure, there is a strong humanitarian tradition that I saw, that I experienced when I was up there covering the border this time around, when in the past, and the same humanitarian tradition that I experienced in the south in 2015 when there were boatloads of Rohingya floating outside of Thai territory. There's a strong urge by Thai communities to actually supply them, to help them as best we can. But the response from the authority does not reflect that humanitarian tradition. And this shift of attitude will be very important in days and months ahead as things are deteriorating in Myanmar. Thank you.
Yeah, Panu, thank you for that very much. So I think one thing is, and I see there's also a question specifically about the treatment of wounded, injured refugees, actually, or displaced people from Myanmar. But one thing I think is that was clearly the situation a couple of weeks ago. So it's really in recent days. What's your feeling? What are you hearing about? Yes, and also you, Sally. But the recent days in terms of the sort of thing what you've highlighted is the disconnect on the border, what officials on the ground up there are telling you, and what the government and the national government spokesman is telling media in Bangkok. I mean, clearly Thailand is not happy about being made to look. I mean, that was so clearly, the disconnect was so clearly exposed. So what's your sense now of the connections between what's happening and what the government is actually acknowledging, and if policies have shifted?
I think there's several levels to that question. I mean, on the one hand, yes, I think the faith issue, I think Bangkok really wants to represent, we want to show that they're doing a lot to help the humanitarian situation, and the word humanitarian in Thai is often used, right, in these contexts. But I think the disconnect remains. I think the situation at the border is very much highlighted right now as a national security issue, and especially with the third wave of this COVID outbreak, I think the authorities, especially the military, are extra sensitive about this border situation. I mean, how sensitive they are. They were spraying, jungled area with, COVID, whatever, to try to clean the area where these refugees were, staying for only a few days. In the middle of the jungle, that takes 4 hours drive into, the road is not even paved, right? So it's just so, but I mean, the sense is that there's a real, in terms of the attitude, and on a serious note, I mean, it's important to understand that the disconnect continues. And on one hand, we're going to have this ASEAN meeting at the end of this week, and the Thais, the Thai diplomats have been, Thai government so far has been ambiguous about its stance on Myanmar, but the word humanitarian is often used, right? They want the violence to stop, and they want humanitarian assistance to come, to materialize. But judging by what's going on at the border, we're dealing with a very different Thailand than 10 years ago. We're dealing with different Thailand 20 years ago, with different border conflict. So we have to see, we have to wait and see. There are other relationships at work, but diplomatically speaking, yes, I think Thailand do want to present itself, from interviewing people, talking to government spokesmen or whatever. They want to be appearing to be helping the humanitarian situation.
But you're saying it's not.
Well, let's see into the next influx, I guess, the response. I mean, and can I just add one thing? I mean, the response at the border, got to be fair to the Thai military, also depends on different commanders. Local commanders matters. And I've seen commanders in Massaud who have been there for years, for decades. He hasn't faced with the crisis yet, but his attitude and his planning, immaculate. Sally mentioned they've assigned areas, some of them are not built up. Yeah, sure, but at least his attitude is that, we need to take them in and give them care for a certain amount of time, right? You go to different areas, what we saw in Mae Hong Son, Masariang, a different area, they have different attitude. Their idea is just, we're going to keep them at the border and push them back as soon as possible. So we're dealing not only a not synchronized, disconnect between Bangkok and local area. We're dealing with different, lack of synchronization between different commanders, different areas, the way that the soldiers are, treated these, I didn't get to see the actual treatment, obviously, but I've heard from my current sources and such. But, you got to be mindful why the Thai military do one thing. You have local officials, other departments, the forestry department, or whatever, who are treating these fleeing refugees in different ways because they themselves are ethnic Karen also.
Right. I see. Thank you for that. And we will, I think we're going to move on very soon to look at this whole unravelling effort for ASEAN to coordinate discussing a possible way out of the crisis. We'll come to that, but over to Sally and the question that we asked about the treatment of wounded and injured refugees. This question from Patrick Wyland of MSF. Were wounded or sick refugees in need of medical care also pushed back by the Thai military? We've just heard that example that Panu talked about, but again, what's your latest impression in the last couple of weeks? And if either of our ethnic representatives have a view too, but Sally first.
I mean, first, just to say, I absolutely, totally concur with what Kampanu says regarding the disconnect and how we may get a policy at the national level and how it's implemented at a provincial level is totally dependent on local authorities, on local commanders. And so we can expect to see, as we see different influxes along the border, that it will be managed very differently. Some can be very heavy-handed and some can be much more relaxed and easygoing. And I think one has to note also that typically local communities have been the best protection that new arrivals have had. Local Thai communities, because a lot of them share similar ethnicity. The relations have been there for decades, and so therefore they have always rallied around new arrivals, and we can't forget that when you get a new influx. I think so far we have to say that it hasn't been tested since. Okay, we've had the influx in Mae Hong Son, we've seen the reactions, we didn't get access as the humanitarian community. So can I say, was there further treatment of people who are injured or sick? Well, at the moment we know there are people in hiding in these remote areas and there is no access to them. And I think one of the things going forward is, yes, it is about national security, the border. Yes, the military are going to detain people, but we also have to distinguish between what is the military's role in securing the international border and what is a humanitarian role. And we need to give more emphasis to local authorities to be able to also carry that humanitarian responsibility while respecting that the military also have a role to play. Right. So I think we've got to work on those issues, but definitely it's a very different Thailand to what it was, say, 10, 20 years ago, and we don't know really how this is going to play out.
Right. So actually, to our ethnic representatives, to someone who works related to the Thai border refugee issue, who's in the north, has message saying that pointing out, as you mentioned, that the Tatmadaw was recently reported, and also we saw photos of them shooting at one boat delivering supplies, and actually twice, and now no boats are daring to make that arduous journey to deliver humanitarian aid. So the concern is further increased, I think, about injury or being shot in delivering any kind of relief supplies to refugees. So overall, the risks of injury and the treatment of injured people, I think, is an ongoing issue. I wonder if either of you there on the screen have a thought on that topic we were just talking about. Wakushi?
Yes. Yes, actually, yes, just yesterday, 2 times actually, yesterday and the day before, the boat that transport the humanitarian aid were shot. I mean, the military, the Burma army, that the posts are close to the border open fire. Right now, like the boat driver, the local people are scared to travel and also to deliver aid to the IDPs areas.
Right.
But the situations inside, there are also over 30,000 people that are currently hiding, like deep inside, not at the border. And it's really difficult for the humanitarian to reach those who are currently continue hiding inside deep inside the current
jungles,
state.
yeah.
Jungle. And the extract, the fighter jets fly over the villages and rather districts nearly every day. So they have to live in constant fear, and as well as the military base that continue shelling. And we keep see like many wounded villagers, the dead bodies, and also, you know, those who are wounded deep inside, we don't know where they can access to the treatment and to the hospital. And
Right.
We expect that there will be more people, you know, coming to the border, and
Right.
it will be very
So
difficult.
compounded with that situation of the boats being shot at and the suspension of aid, Ben Savasti Thompson is asking how will aid in that case be provided to displaced Karen with the suspension of any efforts to deliver by boat?
We also have other transportation routes by truck, not only by the boats. But since there's open now, we want to, you know, send the supplies as much as we could. Some are by truck and some are by car, but now the by boat is suspended. So we have the emergency committee team among the community-based organization that's in charge of the, you know, managing the humanitarian aid, and
Right.
they are the one that's managing this through also work with the local Karen communities, as you know, both sides of the border are Karen.
Right. Okay. So clearly the pressure is mounting perhaps on Thailand if the situation deteriorates further to actually even agree to some temporary acceptance of temporary IDPs even, I presume.
Yeah, the current IDP that are in the Thai side were asked to go back. They are not pushed to go back. They are not pushed to go back, but they are asked to go back. So, like
right.
those who are
Okay.
elderly and those who are sick, and you know, the children can stay in the Thai side,
Right.
but those who are well enough, and you know, they have to go back to current side.
They want to go back.
They are asked to go back.
Right. Thank you. And Moon Lee, you were looking like you had something to say. A little bit of a different situation in Kachin, I guess.
Yeah, I think mostly the same situation, but the different is I already mentioned that you know, geographically we are very far from Thailand, so that's why all of the people who have in danger or in risky
On the
or
Chinese
to
border.
the safety, so that's why that is very difficult to find a safety place. So most of the IDP are flee to the care or control area. So in current situation is also the Burma army are, you know, they are using like a same pattern and same impunity, like a you know, committed this kind of the crimes by using the jet fighter and bombing and also, you know, shelling to the villagers. They are just target to the civilians. So that's why this kind of things are maybe the same all of you know, in the whole country.
Right.
So
Thank you. So we're just with the attention turning to Thailand and the news today. I think it's confirmed, is it, that Thailand's Prime Minister will not go to the ASEAN meeting. There were some very thin hopes that ASEAN might be able to put some pressure on the junta in Myanmar, or at least be useful. That's looking increasingly like that's not the case. So Zunetta Herbert has asked a question. Perhaps I'll direct it to Panu. What's the significance of the Thai Prime Minister deciding not to go to the ASEAN meeting?
Well, I mean, this special ASEAN meeting was a long time coming. You know, it was a lot of. We've learned from our sources that there were a lot of discussion among ASEAN members that Thailand has been giving, at least publicly, mixed signal about, an overall how far is ASEAN ready to deal with the situation in Myanmar. And Thailand has been the most ambiguous compared to, say, Indonesia or Singapore or Malaysia. They were much clearer about the need to do something. But if you talk about, from talking to diplomats and retired diplomats, I think the key wording, despite Prime Minister Prayut not attending the meeting, I think the key wording that the Thais will be pushing for is humanitarian assistance. And ASEAN is one of these. I mean, we're going to have an actual event next week on the FCCT, so please tune into that on ASEAN diplomacy, right? But just going into a little bit now, I think one of the key sort of success story of ASEAN. I mean, ASEAN is one of these organizations where it's very, it moves very slowly. It relies on consensus, right? And it prefers non-intervention. But there are some success stories, notable success stories. The Cyclone Nargis response, and that was under the wing of humanitarian assistance. That was ASEAN getting into military-ruled Myanmar to give assistance to civilians. Yeah. But again, that's the natural disaster. This is a political sort of conflict, so it's a different context. But there are precedents, right? I mean, also the famous example that a lot of ASEAN diplomats tells me is the case with with the Vietnam invasion of Cambodia and the assistance given to the Thai. I mean, I was very young then, so I wasn't a reporter, but I read about it. But that example has also been often used by ASEAN diplomats. But even in that context, it relies on really good relations with China. It relies on the Chinese responses. It relies on a favorable UN Security Council kind of decision, a consensus building globally, if you like, to block the Soviet influence. Yeah. But yeah, I mean, I can't answer you, Gwen, how significant the decision of Prime Minister Prayut not joining for this ASEAN summit. But I'm giving you the context, I guess. Right.
Well, further to the context, I think the other thing that comes to mind is 2017-18. Thailand and ASEAN did actually end up grasping some of the nettle of the Rohingya crisis, and a meeting was hosted here. We were all amazed they even got that far, actually. But so you can say ASEAN did actually kick in somewhat into the Rohingya situation as well. Sally, does the ASEAN aspect, obviously the border NGOs, but international is very important to you, and also, I mean, to our ethnic representatives, the international is crucial to, recognition, acknowledgement of issues and support. I mean, does it make any difference to you whether ASEAN got its act together or not? Do you think perhaps, there is various proposals for some cooperation, coordination on humanitarian issues concerning Myanmar that are actually being kicked around for this upcoming meeting? I don't know if that's come across your radar at all.
No, I mean, I would think absolutely it matters what ASEAN thinks. I think it is, sadly, less and less is, Western governments have less and less influence in this region, and I think it is the ASEAN countries who can put pressure on Myanmar because they are trading. They are a trading bloc. I mean, I think perhaps when we look at the situation of COVID, which is potentially, we don't know what's happening with COVID in Myanmar. It could be a regional issue. It could be something that does affect Thailand. Thailand is concerned. They see people from Myanmar potentially as a super spreader, and they've done so well to flatten the curve up until this last couple of weeks that it is something for them that they want to remain in control of. Now, is that another way through this? And I think ASEAN usually says it's internal, it's an internal affair, but as the refugees spill over the borders, it no longer is internal. You can't say non-intervention. It becomes regional. Right. So when refugees are coming across, if they come across in large numbers, if we do have if this builds to a point where we have a very large-scale influx in Thailand, well then, absolutely, it's a regional issue that ASEAN has to engage, well, Thailand will have to engage in. It can't just not turn up at the table.
Right.
And so, yes, I think absolutely. I think we really should be encouraging where it is with Indonesia and the moves they're making at the moment, whether it's with the National Unity Government, etc., to engage, to engage with Myanmar wherever they can. The more localized it is, the better it is. The more it stays within ASEAN, perhaps there's more chance to actually affect something, yes.
Right, thank you. I think that's spot on, actually. And before I turn to you, Phil, it's one of the questions you kindly relayed to us since we are on the ASEAN topic. And if any of you would like to answer this, Neil Pochka from AFIDA asks, with Min Aung Hlaing invited to the ASEAN crisis meeting, what does that signal in terms of recognition of the junta by ASEAN to actually invite the leader of it? And is international pressure likely to influence ASEAN one way or another on, I guess he means on this issue and on engagement with the actual junta? I totally agree with you, Sally, about engaging with the CRPH's new National Unity Government, but what about the fact that ASEAN decided to go the conventional route and invite this sort of illegitimate leader of the country? Does that spring some thoughts?
Well, I understand he's accepted online.
Yes, online only, apparently, which is not surprising. If I was him, I wouldn't leave the country for a minute.
Yeah, absolutely.
Could be a bit of a Musharraf situation. Yes, I know, yeah.
Do I think this is the time to be inviting him to the ASEAN meeting? No, I do not.
Right.
I think at this point ASEAN needs to decide how it's going to approach Myanmar.
Right.
This is something they've got to come together to decide what is it, what is the pressure that they're going to be able to put on Myanmar against a military that has shown no willingness in any negotiations, right, as we've seen throughout the entire peace process, the negotiations around the nationwide ceasefire agreement. There has been no attempt at compromise. It's been none. Right. So there was no progress in all those years of supposed talks. So who has the golden key on how you negotiate with the military? It's
right. Clearly no one. So I think if either of you, Muneli or Wakushi, have any thoughts about the inviting of Min Aung Hlaing to the ASEAN. I think I can guess what you think, but you might want to say something.
So this is really shocking for us because everybody, international community already know what happened in Burma. And also, who killed to the Kachin, that is the same people, the same group, who killed to the Karen and all of the ethnic people, including now the people from the urban area. That is the same group. So why they invite to that, Min Aung Hlaing? Right. So that's why it is really shocking for us. And it is very clear that ASEAN are really support to doing this kind of the crime and human rights violation in the ground. So it is very clear ASEAN are support to doing human rights violation.
Right. Thank you. And Wakushi, do you think that sort of completely destroys any trust or hope in ASEAN from your perspective?
If they invite Min Aung Hlaing.
Could you speak up, please?
Sorry. If they invited Min Aung Hlaing to come, it is the same invited criminal to sit at the ASEAN, and it's shameful to the ASEAN because everybody know what's happening and what he has been doing it to the people of Burma. And already over 700 people that have been killed recently by him. So that it will be embarrassing for the Asean for heavy criminal, joining the event.
Right. Thank you. Phil.
Hi, Phil Robertson from Human Rights Watch and also a board member of the FCCT. 2 questions, actually. We're having more and more people that are coming to the border and are seeking protection to be able to stay in Thailand. But I understand also that the UN Refugee Agency, UNHCR, has been told by the Thai government that they cannot conduct refugee status determination and they cannot offer protection for people from Myanmar who come to Thailand. What's your comment on that? And what do you think the Thai government should be doing in that? And then the second part of this is also, there's been a lot of discussion about setting aside football fields and warehouses and empty fields, as Sally said, for people to be quarantined, people who are so-called fleeing from unrest. But so far, no one has come. And my question is, I guess, what is the plan for the Thai government, as far as you can tell, for these quarantine centers? And particularly, if someone goes to one of these quarantine centers for, say, 2 weeks, then what happens to them after that? Are they free to go? Can they, go to Bangkok, or can they go to a refugee camp, or they can go somewhere else? What is the perception, of not only what the Thais are saying at the border, but also for our friends online, what people are seeing from the Myanmar side, particularly from areas like Karen State?
Right, thanks, Phil. I presume you're directing that initially to Sally. Well, I think perhaps we'll start with over to you again, Sally. Oh, really?
Okay. So perhaps the first one was relation to UNHCR. Yes, UNHCR has been denied access to the new arrivals who crossed in Mae Hong Son. They were not able to gain access. But also, we have to note that there hasn't been a refugee status determination in the border areas for over 16, 17 years. And it has never been, and even when people have come across the border, they've been recognized, if you like, as de facto refugees or displaced people while they're in the camps. But that's it. They've had no legal status as refugees. It is not a traditional UNHCR refugee status determination process here in Thailand. It's a board that's gathered by local different Thai agencies in the border areas, and people were screened when they came forward in large groups, and essentially it's been a group screening in the refugee camps, not individual screening. Currently, there is no official procedure at all. UNHCR should be given access to these people who are crossing the border. They should be given access to see, are there people who have really serious, legitimate protection concerns of whether it's political persecution, not people just coming for humanitarian, say, support and protection, but really looking at the profile of people crossing the border, because by and large what we've seen over the years is ethnic communities coming as villagers into areas, staying in these very basic refugee camps. We're looking at potentially more mixed populations as people come from the urban areas. You're looking at people with high political profiles. You've got journalists, you're going to have doctors, you're going to have people who have government civil servants who have left and are fleeing. We could have a whole range of people who, as Panu earlier mentioned, the concerns when you have the relationships at a local level, who knows if they're going to be exposed when they cross the border. If they are identified, will they be guaranteed protection in Thailand, or will they be pushed back because it seems to be quiet across the border along with everybody else? So there are some really serious potential protection issues that have to be addressed, and absolutely yes, the UN should be given access to these people to be able, if this is for the Thai authorities to screen people, but UNHCR should be able to verify the profile of these people crossing the border and seeking asylum.
I'd just like to leap in here to make it very clear that the FCCT did invite UNHCR to appear on this panel and lobbied, and not just, there's two elements here for UNHCR in Thailand, the country operation and a regional operation, which also would have dealings with some of the other border situations in this region, including the refugees on Myanmar's western borders and I presume northern, although the only official response we've had from UNHCR is that they are negotiating with Thailand to have access to the refugees, and that's all we are told. The other question was about quarantine. Panu, would you like first of all to address?
I just want to answer Phil's questions in terms of what in my reporting, what I've encountered when at Masariang, right, in the middle of this crisis, after the 27th of March, I've heard several local officials who have mentioned openly in their meetings that, UNHCR is absolutely the agency that we probably need help from. And then the military commander in that meeting said, but their access is only, they have to go through us. They have to go through the Thai military in order to get to the refugee. They should not have a direct access to the displaced people. That was a directive cited by a district chief citing the National Security Council. So apparently it has been protocoled into the National Security Council here in Bangkok, which, the office is in Prime Minister's office, that this is the protocol approach, if you like, that all assistance and access to displaced people have to go through Thai military authorities. Right. And to answer Phil's second question, I have a long chat to a very nice military commander on another part of the border down below in Masot about their long-term situation if the displaced people, the refugees, gone through the 14 days screening and quarantine, is that they actually prepared some areas for, surprisingly enough, they're called asylum seekers, and they've also prepared some areas for those that have to stay longer than a month. And they even said, so I'm not sure if you heard this, but they said that if there are those that want to stay longer than a month, this local commander said they're even prepared to maybe bloat it or push some of these numbers into the existing camps. But this is from a military commander, and
Wasn't he the one that was removed?
Anyway, it's from a commander who, this is kind of his own initiative, if you like, but he's been living in the border for a long time. He understands the situation. But I mean, I'm just saying that it's not entirely, hopeless, I guess. I mean, there are different approaches and different thinking about this whole thing, and it's not inconceivable that there's a long-term angle here, but across the border, in recent times, in this past month, the thinking is that it's all short-term. It's all short-term stay and then push back.
Right. And Sally, do you think that, is it acceptable for UNHCR if they were given some form of access that could only go through the Thai military first?
I'm not a UNHCR spokesperson.
I'm just saying, do you think it would be?
I cannot answer that question. Well, but I think it's fair to say that the Thai military has the security of the border. So in that sense, yes, if people want access at the immediate border, then if they have to go through the Thai military to get access, but then there should be there's then a process of screening which itself has to be done with confidentiality.
Right, and I think
that's the issue, is how you protect people's privacy and how you protect the information that is gathered during these screening processes. And I think that's something at the moment, if the screening is just conducted, say, by the military, how is the information that they're being gathered? Where is the privacy of that information? Where is the protection of it?
Right. And I think, Wakushi, what's the perception inside about, you know, this whole issue of dealing with Thai military and the UNHCR role?
Yes, actually the people that we are supporting, and those who have arrived in our areas, they are scared to come to Thailand because they worry that, because of the two countries are working together, and it's not safe for them to come, so that they mostly choose to stay in current site. But as the situation is also getting worse and the military is expanding, their activities into different areas, and if the offensive continue and airstrike continue, and we think that the UNHCR will really have to push for the Thai government and advocate for the Thai government not only to allow humanitarian access to the IDP, but also to open up and provide shelter and provide refuge for those who will come to the Thai side. And even though there are CDN people that arrive, if the fighting, the Burma army come and attack the area, then everyone will have to cross to the border.
Right. Okay, thank you. And maybe the gentleman there, please identify yourself.
Sure. Yeah, I'm Larry Doors. I'm an FCCT member and also worked with community groups in Myanmar for some years. I'm struggling a little with some of the logic, accepting that there is a Thai national concern. And it's not just the Thai army, it's not the Thai government, it's not the Prime Minister's office. There is a national concern about COVID here, and that really does play into this whole thing. But doesn't it then make sense to facilitate the safety and well-being of people who have not crossed the border, who are on the other side of the border? Doesn't it serve the Thai national interest, which is to not have people at this time during COVID crossing the border, to encourage a level of safety, which might relate to the fighter jets flying over and the bombing attacks and so forth, and to facilitate cross-border assistance to allow people to live in safety and have enough food and have medical treatment? Doesn't that actually serve the Thai interest? And if so, is it possible that we will move toward that? And, but I would also ask the panelists, is that something that we want to focus on, or is it more important to focus on facilitating the opportunities for people to cross the border and find safety, if they can, here inside Thailand? Does that make sense?
Right, so that was directed to?
Pretty well, to those who are advocating on behalf of either the IDPs or the refugees, either side of the border.
I don't mind. I'll kick off if you like. Because I think generally nobody crosses the border because they want to be in another country. And I think people, we see it in Myanmar, people are internally displaced for years. They move and they move and they move and they move. They cross the border as a last resort. So I think we could well see people being internally displaced and the numbers of internally displaced increasing as long as they're not in imminent danger. But I mean, if you get airstrikes, why, really, why did people cross the border this time? There were airstrikes, and they left because of that. And I think generally, though, people are not looking to come to Thailand for the long term. They're looking to come to Thailand for protection. They need protection from imminent danger, from attack. So overall, I think that it is important to have a response to internally displaced people, particularly at this time in Myanmar. I mean, in the ethnic areas, they've got decades of experience of responding to conflict. They've built capacity amongst local organizations. We're saying, well, the international community hasn't got access to these areas. Well, they have the ethnic health providers, their own education, their own community networks, and on, and they have the capacity to respond if they're given the resources. And I think that's what we have to be looking at more, is how do you support ethnic service health providers to actually still be developing their health system, healthcare, so that they can respond to people coming into their areas. They need quarantine centers, they need testing facilities, they need access to testing. They should, when the vaccination scheme is rolled out, why can't they get vaccines into Myanmar, into these areas, so that you're then containing COVID within the country, and they want to manage it. They themselves had set up their own screening posts, but we saw the military actually dismantling screening posts in some of the ethnic areas. So they have the ability to do it if there's the willingness to support it. If the international community and the donor community are able to put resources, and I think this is something that has to be looked at more, is some of the development resources, how they can be reallocated towards this emergency response. We've seen sort of the response, it goes 180 degrees. During the conflict, there was more support going to some of the ethnic service providers. When the NLD came into power in 2015, there was a fundamental shift where resources were going through the central government, and it will take years to trickle down into these ethnic areas. We then saw the terrible Rohingya crisis, which suddenly the international community thought, help, we can't keep putting our resources through central government. We've got to look at these ethnic areas into the areas where IDPs are and the minorities, and how we can support their structures to be able to for their communities. And this is what's got to be done in parallel to what is happening in the urban areas. But actually the CDM, it is a nationwide movement, but there's still plenty of scope for developing these areas, the ethnic areas, potentially where we're going to see many, many more IDPs. And absolutely, it's got to be in the Thai interest if people are able to still find services and humanitarian support. Because at the moment, I mean, livelihoods is just, the options for livelihoods is just vanishing. Before, in the southeast, you already had perhaps 80% of the people had somebody in Thailand working to support those communities back there. Well, with COVID, all those people had to return back to Myanmar, to where there was not the livelihoods opportunities anyway, and they'd been cut off in Thailand, and now you have this, so it's all compounded to make it even worse. So yes, absolutely, but at the same time, people will have to cross into Thailand when they're in imminent danger, and it's then that you do need to ensure that there's a humanitarian response for those people and for the others who have individuals where we've seen arrest warrants out. So there's absolute targeting of key people, whether it's because of their use and how they've in social media, whether it's the celebrities, whether it's the doctors, etc. There are key people who are directly being targeted for what they've done, and those people have to have protection when they cross into Thailand. It's not just the humanitarian response, but it really is that protection side. So it's both sides, sorry.
No, thank you very much. That was a brilliant answer. And actually, I'd like to add this, which is kind of related to that very interesting question, which will be the final question, and all or any of you are welcome to address it. It does relate to the issue of assistance going forward from now. and this increasingly difficult situation deteriorating rapidly. This was from Thompson Chow with Frontier in Myanmar. Will this refugee crisis spark a fundamental change in how aid donors, whether they're American, European, Japanese, or from any other area, how they approach Myanmar? And do you expect a lot of future aid to be allocated more to humanitarian assistance? And obviously this deteriorating situation in ethnic areas is a core part of that. And, you know, how and when would you see this sort of, the kind of time frame and nature of that shift? So that's a kind of difficult question to predict things, but well, Wakushi, you're looking like you want to say something, or Moon Lee.
In the past, we can see that because of the international see Burma as a reform, so reform taking place in Burma. So most of the support go back inside Burma. But what we need to understand is that the ethnic people have been fighting for the self-determination as so that for the ethnic people, we have our own existing the structure, that governing structure like a government. And as Sally mentioned, that we have our own health department, education department, and so that we also manage and run our own healthcare and educations. And in the past, it has been very difficult, and not only for the reduction of funding for the IDP refugees, but also from the border. And we have seen that some of the international that they try to support the centralized instead of supporting, try to solve the root cause and supporting the ethnic structure, the ethnic struggle, and supporting the existing structure, and try to bring us down under the Burmese centralized government and weakening the existing structure of the ethnic people from the border. And but now it's clear that the healthcare system and all the system in Burma is now failed and destroyed, and that's the only system and the only structure that continue to provide support and continue to provide refuge is in the ethnic area, ethnic structure. So that this is why we have been advocating that for the international donor to work directly to the community-based organizations, and also to support the existing ethnic structures, and also to treat refugees as part of, because of the conflict, they have been become refugee because of the conflict. But during the reform process, they have been ignored, and that most of the funding have been cut. Right. Even though we talking about the peace process, we talking about the reform democracy in Burma, but then we continue to marginalize those who have been marginalized, and this is why we that things are not sustainable and it's failed. This is why we need to look at a different approach and supporting the existing structure.
Right. Thank you. Anyone else? Moon Lee, do you have any thoughts on that? Particularly given that, when you mentioned trying to put assistance into community-based inside Myanmar, this must be becoming, almost an impossibility with the tightening, the crackdowns, very difficult to channel such kind of aid and humanitarian assistance. Panu, you want to? Yep.
Well, absolutely what Wakushi said, but even more so. I remember covering the border areas, before 2015 election, and see how the mood of the world and the aid community changed after the 2015 election. It's just devastating. You start seeing schools, you start seeing clinics, healthcare facilities collapsing, going out of fundings on this side of the border that has normally served not only just IDP, but ordinary Karen people crossing over for a daily or for education. Even people coming as far as Yangon, coming to get education training at schools and universities in Masot. There's all this informal network, links to some of the Thai education authorities as well as local NGOs, Thais and Karen and others. This funding just disappeared after 2015 election because the world was so excited about the new Myanmar, right? And then look what happened. I think
you're saying aid was pulled out very quickly.
Yeah, very quickly.
Very quickly.
And I think there's there's a real disconnect. I mean, I've been using this word the whole time today, but between back then that I noticed between global perception about the situation and what actually transpired on the ground. Some of these people that go to schools or go to clinics, they don't change overnight. It's still going to be in Masot. It's still going to be in the border area. And for those people who've covered this area, journalists or NGOs or whatever, we understand and we saw how that changed so quickly just because of an election.
Right. That's very instructive. Whatever goes quickly can also come back quickly, though, as you're probably seeing now, Sally.
I think for sure we're already seeing changes. Certainly governments have suspended certain areas of their funding. We are seeing more of a focus towards humanitarian response. How long that will continue, one doesn't know. And I guess at this point, it's very hard when a lot of the perhaps development funding was looking more around governance. It was previously around governance, around peace building, a lot of these issues. Well, at the moment, where are they? I mean, we don't know what is going to be governing Myanmar within this next year. What will it look like? What will the authorities look like? We have to be encouraged, however, that if we look at, say, the current makeup of, say, the National Unity Government and the fact the inclusion of a much more diverse range or representation from ethnic groups in age, in gender, it in of itself, you would hope, therefore, that we won't see this very sort of polarized, we're supporting the ethnic groups, now we're supporting the central government, now it's sort of like, I used to think everything in Myanmar was a bit like a sort of weathercock on a building, in which way the wind blew this way, and suddenly...
Yeah, it's not one or the other.
Yes, it should never be one or the other, and I would hope that what a lot of the CDM has been about, it wasn't just about the coup, it was saying enough is enough and we want to now be part of this. And we all want to be a part of it. And it's this movement, it's the energy that's generated, it's brought in something new and really needs to be supported and built upon.
And built on, exactly.
And that's and take that momentum going forward.
Right.
It is that new generation saying we want to be a part of this. No more of the old way of working. Yeah.
Right.
Thank you.
Thank you, Sally. We're out of time, but I'd just like to say I think the inputs, particularly from our Karen and Kachin representatives and our two excellent in-house panelists here have, I think, really given some important insights into the situation as it's evolving, and I think a lot of eyes will be on what transpires with ASEAN in coming days, but also on the border and into these ethnic areas. Thank you, both of you, for giving us some real insight, and to Sally and Panu. And don't forget, on Thursday we're looking at the return of the red shirts in that program, and next week we'll assess what does transpire with the ASEAN situation, but we will be maintaining the momentum on Myanmar. There are so many issues, and it's such an important period to keep the spotlight on and give voice, we hope, through the Foreign Correspondents Club too, as a forum for expression and a lot of discussion on this extreme situation we're seeing on the doorstep here. So please keep an eye on our schedules and support the Foreign Correspondents Club. We're struggling to keep going despite the new and heavy restrictions. So at the very least, look at our live streams, or if we're doing physical events, we can assure you that this is very socially distanced and secure. So thank you very much, Mun Nei Lee, Wakushi, Sally Thompson, and Panu Wongchum. Good night.
Thank you.